The Story of Civilization, Volume 6, The Reformation, by Will Durant. Part 2, continued. Cassette 6, Side 2. These persecutions were the supreme failure of Francis's reign. The courage of the martyrs gave dignity and splendor to their cause. Thousands of onlookers must have been impressed and disturbed who, without these spectacular executions, might never have bothered to change their inherited faith. Despite the recurrent terror, clandestine swarms of Protestants existed in 1530 in Lyon, Bordeaux, Orléans, Reims, Amiens, Poitiers, Bourges, Nîmes, La Rochelle, Châlons, Dijon, Toulouse. Huguenot legions sprang almost out of the ground. Francis, dying, must have known that he had left his son not only the encompassing hostility of England, Germany, and Switzerland, but a heritage of hate in France herself. 5. Habsburg and Valois, 1515 to 1526. It was not to be expected that so volatile a monarch would be content to surrender all the hopes that had agitated his predecessors for adding Milan, and if possible Naples, as brilliants in the French crown. Louis XII had accepted the natural limits of France, had recognized, so to speak, the sovereignty of the Alps. Francis withdrew the recognition and challenged the right of Duke Maximilian Sforza to Milan. During several months of negotiations, he collected and equipped an immense force. On August 15th, he led it by a new and perilous path, blasting his way across rocky cliffs, over the Alps and down into Italy. At Marignano, 9 miles from Milan, the French knights and infantry met Sforza's Swiss mercenaries in 2 days, September 13th and 14th, 1515, of such killing as Italy had not known since the barbarian invasions. 10,000 men were left dead on the ground. Time and again the French seemed defeated, when the king himself charged to the front and rallied his troops by the example of his daring. It was customary for a ruler victorious in battle to reward special bravery by creating new knights on the field. But before doing this, Francis, in an unprecedented but characteristic gesture, knelt before Pierre, Seigneur de Bayard, and asked to be knighted by the hand of the famous chevalier sans peur et sans reproche. Bayard protested that the king was ex officio the Knight of Knights, and needed no dubbing. But the young sovereign, still only 21, insisted. Bayard went through the traditional motions magnificently, and then put away his sword, saying, "Assuredly, my good sword, thou shalt be well guarded as a relic, and honoured above all others, for having this day conferred upon so handsome and puissant a king the order of chivalry, and never will I wear thee more except against Turks, Moors, and Saracens." Francis entered Milan as its master, sent its deposed duke to France with a comfortable pension, took also Parma and Piacenza, and signed with Leo X, in splendid ceremonies at Bologna, a treaty and concordat that allowed both Pope and King to claim a diplomatic victory. Francis returned to France the idol of his countrymen, and almost of Europe. He had charmed his soldiers by sharing their hardships and outbraving their bravery. And though in his triumph he had indulged his vanity, he tempered it by giving credit to others, softening all egos with words of praise and grace. In the intoxication of fame, he made his greatest mistake. He entered his candidacy for the imperial crown. He was legitimately disturbed by the prospect of having Charles I, King of Spain and Naples and Count of Flanders and Holland, become also head of the Holy Roman Empire, with all those claims to Lombardy and therefore Milan for which Maximilian had so repeatedly invaded Italy. Within such a new empire, France would be surrounded by apparently invincible enemies. Francis bribed and lost. Charles bribed more and won in 1519. The bitter rivalry began that kept Western Europe in turmoil till within 3 years of the king's death. Charles and Francis never ran out of reasons for hostility. Even before becoming emperor, Charles had claimed Burgundy through his grandmother Mary, daughter of Charles the Bold, and had refused to recognize the reunion of Burgundy with the French crown. Milan was formally a fief of the empire. Charles continued the Spanish occupation of Navarre. Francis insisted that it should be returned to his vassal, Henri d'Albret. And above all these casus belli lay the question of questions. Who was to be master of Europe, Charles or Francis? The Turks answered, Suleiman. Francis struck the first blow. Noting that Charles had on his hands a political revolution in Spain and a religious revolution in Germany, he sent an army across the Pyrenees to recapture Navarre. It was defeated in a campaign whose most important incident was the wounding of Ignatius Loyola in 1521. Another army went south to defend Milan. The troops mutinied for lack of pay. They were routed at Le Bicocca, by imperial mercenaries, and Milan fell to Charles V in 1522. To cap these mishaps, the constable of the French armies went over to the emperor. Charles, Duke of Bourbon, was head of the powerful family that would rule France from 1589 to 1792. He was the richest man in the country after the king. 500 nobles were among his retainers. He was the last of the great barons who could defy the monarch of the now centralized state. He served Francis well in war, fighting bravely at Marignano, less well in government, alienating the Milanese by his harsh rule. Ill-supplied there with funds from the king, he laid out 100,000 livres of his own, expecting to be repaid. He was not. Francis looked with jealous misgiving upon this almost royal vassal. He recalled him from Milan and offered him thoughtless or intentional affronts that left Bourbon his brooding enemy. The Duke had married Suzanne of Bourbon, whose extensive estates were by her mother's will to revert to the crown if Suzanne should die without issue. Suzanne so died in 1521, but after making a will that left all her property to her husband. Francis and his mother claimed the property as the most direct descendants of the previous Duke of Bourbon. Charles fought the claim. The Parlement of Paris decided against him. Francis proposed a compromise that would let the Duke enjoy the income of the property till his death. He rejected the proposal. Louise, 51, offered herself as a bride to the 31-year-old Duke, with a clear title to the property as her dowry. He refused. Charles V made a rival offer, the hand of his sister Eleonora in marriage, and full support by imperial troops of the Duke's claims. The Duke accepted, fled by night across the frontier, and was made Lieutenant General of the Imperial Army in Italy in 1523. Francis sent Bonnivet against him. Marguerite's lover proved incompetent. His army was overwhelmed at Romagnano by the Duke, and in the retreat the Chevalier de Bayard, commanding the dangerous rearguard, was fatally wounded by a shot from a harquebus, this on April 30th, 1524. The victorious Bourbon found him dying under a tree and offered him some consolatory compliments. "My lord," answered Bayard, "there is pity for me. I die having done my duty. But I have pity for you, to see you serving against your king, your country, and your oath." The Duke was moved, but had burned all bridges behind him. He entered into an agreement with Charles V and Henry VIII by which all three were to invade France simultaneously, overwhelm all French forces, and divide the land among them. As his part of the bargain, the Duke entered Provence, took Aix, and laid siege to Marseille. But his campaign was poorly provisioned, met unexpectedly strong resistance, and collapsed. He retreated into Italy in September 1524. Francis thought it wise to pursue him and recapture Milan. Bonnivet, foolish to the end, advised him to take Pavia first, and then come upon Milan from the south. The king agreed and laid siege on August 26, 1524. But here, too, the defense was superior to the offense. For 4 months the French host was held at bay, while Bourbon, Charles of Lannoy, Viceroy of Naples, and the Marquis of Pescara, husband of Vittoria Colonna, gathered a new army of 27,000 men. Suddenly this force appeared behind the French. On the same day, February 24th, 1525, Francis found his men assaulted on one side by this unexpected multitude, and on the other by a sortie from Pavia. As usual, he fought in the van of the melee and killed so many of the enemy with his own sword that he thought victory assured. But his generalship was sacrificed to his courage. His forces were poorly deployed. His infantry moved in between his artillery and the foe, making the superior French guns useless. The French faltered. The Duke of Alençon fled, taking the rearguard with him. Francis challenged his disordered army to follow him back into the battle. Only the most gallant of his nobles accompanied him, and a slaughter of French chivalry ensued. Francis received wounds in the face, on the arms and legs, but struck out tirelessly. His horse collapsed under him. Still he fought. His loyal knights fell one by one till he was left alone. He was surrounded by enemy soldiers and was about to be slain when an officer recognized him, saved him, and led him to Lannoy, who, with low bows of respect, accepted his sword. The fallen king was confined in the fortress of Pizzighettone, near Cremona, whence he was allowed to send his oft-quoted, oft-misquoted letter to his mother, who was ruling France in his absence. To the Regent of France, "Madam, that you may know how stands the rest of my misfortune. There is nothing in the world left to me but honor and my life, which is saved. And in order that in your adversity this news might bring you some little comfort, I prayed for permission to write you this letter, entreating you in the exercise of your accustomed prudence to do nothing rash, for I have hope, after all, that God will not forsake me." He sent a similar note to Marguerite, who answered both. "My lord, the joy we are still feeling at the kind letters which you were pleased to write yesterday to me and your mother makes us so happy with the assurance of your health, on which our life depends, that it seems to me that we ought to think of nothing but of praising God and desiring a continuance of your good news, which is the best meat we can have to live on. And inasmuch as the Creator has given us grace that our Trinity should be always united, the other two do entreat you that this letter, presented to you who are the third, may be accepted with the same affection with which it is cordially offered you by your most humble and obedient servants, your mother and sister, Louise Marguerite. To the Emperor at Madrid, Francis wrote a very humble letter, telling him that, if it please you to have so much honourable pity as to answer for the safety which a captive king of France deserves to find, you may be sure of obtaining an acquisition instead of a useless prisoner, and of making a king of France your slave forever. Francis had not been trained to misfortune. Charles received the news of his victory calmly, and refused to celebrate it, as many suggested, with a splendid festival. He retired into his bedroom, we are told, and knelt in prayer. To Francis and Louise he sent what seemed to him moderate terms for peace and the liberation of the king. 1. France must give up Burgundy and all claims to Flanders, Artois, and Italy. 2. All lands and dignities claimed by the Duke of Bourbon must be surrendered to him. 3. Provence and Dauphiné should be made an independent state. 4. France must restore to England all French territory formerly held by Britain, that is, Normandy, Anjou, Gascony, and Guienne. 5. Francis must sign an alliance with the Emperor and join him in a campaign against the Turks. Louise answered that France would not yield an inch of territory and was prepared to defend itself to the last man. The regent acted now with an energy, resolution, and intelligence that made the French people forgive her headstrong faults. She arranged at once for the organization and equipment of new armies, and sent them to guard all points of possible invasion. To keep the Emperor's mind off France, she urged Suleiman of Turkey to defer his attack on Persia and undertake instead a westward campaign. We do not know what part her plea played in the Sultan's decision, but in 1526 he marched into Hungary and inflicted so disastrous a defeat upon the Christian army at Mohacs that any invasion of France by Charles would have been deemed treason to Christendom. Meanwhile, Louise pointed out to Henry VIII and Clement VII how both England and the papacy would be reduced to bondage if the Emperor were allowed all the territory that he demanded. Henry wavered, Louise persisted, and offered him an indemnity of 2,000,000 crowns. He signed a defensive and offensive alliance with France on August 30th, 1525. This female diplomacy opened male eyes and shattered Charles's confidence. By agreement among Louise, Lannoy, and the Emperor, the captive king was transported to Spain. When Francis reached Valencia, on July 2nd, 1525, Charles sent him a courteous letter, but his treatment of his prisoner went no further toward chivalry. Francis was assigned a narrow room in an old castle in Madrid, under rigorous vigilance. The sole freedom allowed him was to ride on a mule near the castle, under watch of armed and mounted guards. He asked Charles for an interview. Charles put it off, and allowed 2 weeks of fretting confinement to incline Francis toward paying a heavy price for liberty. Louise offered to meet the Emperor and negotiate, but he thought it better to play upon his prisoner than have a woman charm him into lenience. She informed him that her daughter Marguerite, now a widow, would be happy if she could be agreeable to his imperial majesty, but he preferred Isabella of Portugal, who with a dowry of 900,000 crowns could provide him at once with bed and board. After 2 months of anxious imprisonment, Francis fell dangerously ill. The Spanish people, regretting the emperor's severity, went to their churches to pray for the French king. Charles prayed too, for a dead ruler would be worthless as a political pawn. He visited Francis briefly, promised him an early release, and sent permission to Marguerite to come and comfort her brother. Marguerite sailed from Aigues-Mortes on August 27, 1525, to Barcelona, and thence was carried by slow and tortuous litter through half the length of Spain to Madrid. She consoled herself with writing poetry and sending characteristically fervent messages to the king. "Whatever may be required of me, though it be to fling to the winds the ashes of my bones to do you service, naught will be strange or difficult or painful to me, but will be solace, ease of mind, honor." When at last she reached the bedside of her brother, she found him apparently recovering, but on September 25th he had a relapse, fell into a coma, and seemed to be dying. Marguerite and the household knelt and prayed, and a priest administered the sacrament. A tedious convalescence followed. Marguerite stayed with Francis a month, then went to Toledo to appeal to the emperor. He received her pleas coldly. He had learned of Henry's league with France and longed to punish the duplicity of his late ally and the audacity of Louise. Francis had one card left to play, though it would almost certainly mean his lifelong imprisonment. Having warned his sister to leave Spain as quickly as possible, he signed on November 1525 a formal letter of abdication in favor of his eldest son, and since this second Francis was a boy of only 8 years, he named Louise, and, in case of her death, Marguerite, as regent of France. Charles saw at once that a king without a kingdom, with nothing to surrender, would be useless. But Francis had more physical than moral courage. On January 14, 1526, he signed with Charles the Treaty of Madrid. Its terms were essentially those that the emperor had proposed to Louise. They were even more severe, for they required that the 2 oldest sons of the king should be handed over to Charles as hostages for the faithful execution of the agreement. Francis further consented to marry the emperor's sister Eleonora, Queen Dowager of Portugal, and he swore that if he should fail to carry out the terms of the treaty, he would return to Spain to resume imprisonment. However, on August 22, 1525, he had deposited with his aides a paper nullifying in advance all pacts, conventions, renunciations, quittances, revocations, derogations, and oaths that he might have to make contrary to his honor and the good of his crown. And on the eve of signing the treaty, he repeated this statement to his French negotiators, and declared that it was through force and constraint, confinement, and length of imprisonment that he was signing, and that all that was contained in it was and should remain null and of no effect. On March 17, 1526, Viceroy Lannoy delivered Francis to Marshal Lautrec on a barge in the Bidassoa River, which separates Spanish Irun from French Vendée, and in return Lannoy received Princes Francis and Henry. Their father gave them a blessing and a tear, and hurried onto French soil. There he leaped upon a horse, cried joyfully, "I am king again," and rode on to Bayonne, where Louise and Marguerite awaited him. At Bordeaux and Cognac he spent 3 months in sports to recover his health, and indulged in a little love. Had he not been a monk for a year? Louise, who had quarrelled with the Comtesse de Chateaubriand, had brought with her a pretty blonde-haired maid of honor, 18 years old, Anne de Huy de Pislieu, who, as planned, struck the king's famished eye. He wooed her in haste, and soon won her as his mistress. And from that moment till death parted them, the new favourite shared with Louise and Marguerite the heart of the king. She put up patiently with his marriage to Eleonora, and with his incidental liaisons. To save appearances, he gave her a husband, Jean de Brosse, made him duke and her Duchesse d'Étampes, and smiled appreciatively when Jean retired to a distant estate in Brittany. 6. War and Peace, 1526 to 1547. When the terms of the Treaty of Madrid became generally known, they aroused almost universal hostility to Charles. The German Protestants trembled at the prospect of facing so strengthened an enemy. Italy resented his claim to suzerainty in Lombardy. Clement VII absolved Francis from the oath he had sworn at Madrid, and joined France, Milan, Genoa, Florence, and Venice in forming the League of Cognac for common defense on May 22, 1526. Charles called Francis no gentleman, bade him return to his Spanish prison, ordered a harsher confinement for the king's sons, and gave free rein to his generals to discipline the Pope. An imperial army collected in Germany and Spain poured down through Italy, scaled the walls of Rome, the Duke of Bourbon dying in the process, sacked the city more thoroughly than any Goths or Vandals had ever done, killed 4,000 Romans, and imprisoned Clement in Sant'Angelo. The emperor, who had remained in Spain, assured a scandalized Europe that his starving army had exceeded his instructions. Nevertheless, his representatives in Rome kept the Pope shut up in Sant'Angelo from May 6th to December 7th, 1527, and exacted from an almost bankrupt papacy an indemnity of 368,000 crowns. Clement appealed to Francis and Henry for aid. Francis dispatched Lautrec to Italy with an army that sacked Pavia in reckless revenge for its resistance 2 years before, and Italy wondered whether French friends were any better than German enemies. Lautrec bypassed Rome and besieged Naples, and the city began to starve. But meanwhile Francis had offended Andrea Doria, head of the Genoese navy. Doria called his fleet from the siege of Naples, went over to the side of the emperor, and provisioned the besieged. Lautrec's army starved in turn. Lautrec himself died, and his army melted away in 1528. The comedy of the rulers hardly relieved the tragedy of the people. When the emissaries of Francis and Henry appeared at Burgos to make a formal declaration of war, Charles retorted to the French envoy, "The King of France is not in a position to address to me such a declaration. He is my prisoner. Your master acted like a dastard and a scoundrel in not keeping his word that he gave me touching the Treaty of Madrid. If he likes to say the contrary, I will maintain my words against him with my body to his." This challenge to a duel was readily accepted by Francis, who sent a herald to tell Charles, "You have lied in your throat." Charles responded grandly, naming a place for the encounter and asking Francis to name the time. But French nobles intercepted the messenger, and judicious delays put off the match to the Greek kalends. Nations had grown so large that their differences of economic or political interest could not be settled by private combat, or by the small mercenary armies that had been playing the game of war in Renaissance Italy. The modern method of decision by competitive destruction took form in this Habsburg-Valois debate. It took 2 women to teach the potentates the art and wisdom of peace. Louise of Savoy communicated with Margaret of Austria, regent of the Netherlands, and suggested that Francis, anxious for the return of his sons, would abandon all claim to Flanders, Artois, and Italy, and would pay a ransom of 2 million gold crowns for his children, but would never cede Burgundy. Margaret persuaded her nephew to defer his claim to Burgundy and to forget the claims of the Duke of Bourbon, now conveniently dead. On August 3, 1529, the 2 women and their diplomatic aides signed La Paix aux Dames, the Ladies' Peace of Cambrai. The ransom was raised out of the commerce, industry, and blood of France, and the royal princes, after 4 years of captivity, returned to freedom with stories of cruel treatment that enraged Francis and France. While the 2 able women found lasting peace, Margaret in 1530, Louise in 1531, the kings prepared to renew their war. Francis turned everywhere for help. To Henry VIII he sent a money appeasement for having almost ignored him in the Cambrai settlement, and Henry, furious at Charles for opposing his divorce, pledged his support to France. Within a year or so, Francis negotiated alliances with the Protestant princes of Germany, with the Turks, and with the Pope. The vacillating pontiff, however, soon made peace with Charles and crowned him emperor in 1530, the last coronation of a Holy Roman Emperor by a pope. Then, frightened by a monarch who had in effect made Italy a province of his realm, Clement sought a new bond with France by offering his niece, Catherine de Médicis, in marriage to Francis's son, Henry, Duke of Orléans. King and Pope met at Marseille on October 28, 1533, and the marriage, pregnant with history, was performed by the Pope himself. A year later Clement died, not yet having made up his mind about anything. The emperor, already old at 35, shouldered his self-imposed burdens with weary fortitude. He was shocked to learn, on the word of the Sultan's vizier to Ferdinand of Austria, that the Turkish siege of Vienna in 1529 had been undertaken in response to an appeal from Francis, Louise, and Clement VII for help against the encompassing empire. Moreover, Francis had allied himself with the Tunisian chieftain Kheireddin Barbarossa, who was harassing Christian commerce in the western Mediterranean, raiding coastal towns, and carrying captive Christians into slavery. Charles collected another army and navy, crossed to Tunis in 1535, captured it, freed 10,000 Christian slaves, and rewarded his unpaid troops by letting them loot the city and massacre the Moslem population. Leaving garrisons in Bona and La Galeta, Charles returned to Rome on April 5, 1535, as the triumphant defender of Christendom against Islam and the King of France. Francis had meanwhile renewed his claim to Milan, and in March 1536 he had conquered the Duchy of Savoy to clear his road into Italy. Charles was furious. In a passionate address before the new pope, Paul III, and the full consistory of cardinals, he recounted his efforts for peace, the French king's violations of the treaties of Madrid and Cambrai, and the alliances of his most Christian Majesty, as Francis was called, with the enemies of the Church in Germany and of Christianity in Turkey and Africa. And he ended by again challenging Francis to a duel. "Let us not continue wantonly to shed the blood of our innocent subjects. Let us decide the quarrel man to man, with what arms he pleases to choose. And after that, let the united forces of Germany, Spain, and France be employed to humble the power of the Turk and to exterminate heresy out of Christendom." It was a subtle speech, for it compelled the Pope to align himself with the Emperor, but no one took seriously its proposal for a duel. Fighting by proxy was much safer. Charles invaded Provence on July 25, 1536, with 50,000 men, hoping to flank or divert the French in Savoy by moving up the Rhone. But Constable Anne de Montmorency ordered the weak French forces to burn in their retreat everything that could supply the imperial troops. Soon Charles, always lacking money and unable to feed his men, abandoned the campaign. Paul III, anxious to free Charles for an attack on the Turks or the Lutherans, persuaded the crippled Titans to meet with him in jealously separate rooms at Nice and to sign a 10-year truce on June 17, 1538. A month later, Eleonora, wife to one, sister to the other, brought king and emperor together in a personal meeting at Aigues-Mortes. There they ceased to be royal and became human. Charles knelt to embrace the king's youngest children. Francis gave him a costly diamond set in a ring which was inscribed Dilectionis Testis et Exemplum, a witness and token of love. And Charles transferred from his own neck to the king's the collar of the Golden Fleece. They went together to hear Mass, and the townspeople, rejoicing in peace, cried, "The Emperor, the King!" When Ghent rebelled against Charles in 1539 and joined Bruges and Ypres in offering themselves to Francis, the king resisted the temptation, and when Charles in Spain found the seaways closed by rebel vessels or mal de mer, Francis granted his request for passage through France. His counselors advised the king to force the emperor en route to sign the cession of Milan to the Duke of Orleans, but Francis refused. "When you do a generous thing," he said, "you must do it completely and boldly." He found his court fool writing in A Fool's Diary the name of Charles V, for, said Tribouillet, "He's a bigger fool than I am if he comes through France." "And what will you say if I let him pass?" asked the king. "I will rub out his name and put yours in his place." Francis let Charles pass unhindered, and ordered every town on the way to receive the emperor with royal honors and feasts. This precarious friendship was ended when Spanish soldiers near Pavia captured French emissaries bearing new offers of alliance from Francis to Suleiman in July 1541. At this time, Barbarossa was again raiding the coastal towns of Italy. Charles sailed from Majorca with another armada to destroy him, but storms so buffeted the fleet that it was compelled to return empty-handed to Spain. The emperor's fortunes were ebbing. His young wife, whom he had learned to love, had died in 1539, and his own health was worsening. In 1542, Francis declared war on him over Milan. The king's allies now included Sweden, Denmark, Gelderland, Cleves, Scotland, the Turks, and the Pope. Only Henry VIII supported Charles, for a price, and the Spanish Cortes refused additional subsidies for the war. A Turkish fleet combined with a French fleet to besiege Nice, which was now imperial territory, as of 1543. The siege failed, but Barbarossa and his Moslem troops were allowed to winter at Toulon, where they openly sold Christian slaves. The emperor patiently retrieved the situation. He found means of pacifying the Pope. He won Philip of Hesse to his side by winking at his bigamy. He attacked and vanquished the Duke of Cleves. He effected a junction with his English allies and faced France with so strong a force that Francis retreated and yielded him the honors of the campaign in October 1543. Again too poor to further provision his army, Charles welcomed an offer of peace and signed with Francis the Treaty of Crépy on September 18, 1544. The king withdrew his claims to Flanders, Artois, and Naples. Charles no longer demanded Burgundy. A Habsburg princess would marry a French prince and bring him Milan as her dowry. Most of this could have been peaceably arranged in 1525. Charles was now free to overwhelm the Protestants at Mühlberg. Titian pictured him there without the arthritis, proud and triumphant, worn and weary after 1,000 vicissitudes, 100 turns of fortune's ironic wheel. As for Francis, he was finished, and France nearly so. In one sense, he had lost nothing but honor. He had preserved his country by scuttling the ideals of chivalry. Yet the Turks would have come without his call, and their coming helped Francis to check an emperor who, unresisted, might have spread the Spanish Inquisition into Flanders, Holland, Switzerland, Germany, and Italy. Francis had found France peaceful and prosperous. He left it bankrupt and on the brink of another war. A month before his death, while swearing friendship with Charles, he sent 20,000 crowns to the Protestants of Germany to support them against the emperor. He, and in slightly less degree Charles, agreed with Machiavelli that statesmen, whose task is to preserve their countries, may violate the moral code which they require from their citizens, whose task is only to preserve their lives. The French people might have forgiven him his wars, but they lost relish for the splendor of his ways and his court when they perceived the cost. He was already unpopular in 1535. He consoled himself with beauty, living and dead. In his later years he made Fontainebleau his favorite residence, rebuilt it, and rejoiced in the graceful feminine art with which the Italians were adorning it. He surrounded himself with a petite bande of young women who pleased him with their good looks and gaiety. In 1538 a disease injured his uvula, and thereafter he stammered shamefully. He tried to cure what was probably his syphilis with mercury pills recommended by Barbarossa, but they had no success. A persistent and ill-smelling abscess broke his spirit, gave a dull and plaintive look to his once keen eyes, and moved him to an uncongenial piety. He had to watch his food, for he suspected that some courtiers who expected to rise under his successor were seeking to poison him. He noted sadly that the court now pivoted around his son, who was already distributing offices and impatiently awaiting his turn at the resources of France. To his deathbed at Rambouillet, he called his sole heir and warned him not to be dominated by a woman, for Henry was already devoted to Diane de Poitiers. The king confessed his sins in hurried summary and, breathing painfully, welcomed death. Francis, Duke of Guise, at the door, whispered to those in the next room, "Le vieux galant s'en va." The old gallant is going. He went, whispering the name of Jesus. He was 53, and had reigned 32 years. France felt that it was too much, but when it had recovered from him, it forgave him everything, because he had sinned gracefully, he had loved beauty, he had been incarnate France. In that same year, Henry VIII died, and 2 years later, Marguerite. She had been too long away from Francis and too far to realize that death was stalking him. When word came to her in a convent at Angoulême that he was seriously ill, she almost lost her reason. "Whosoever shall come to my door," she said, "and announce to me the recovery of the king my brother, such a courier, should he be tired and worn out, muddy and dirty, I will go and kiss and embrace as if he were the sprucest prince and gentleman in France. And should he be in want of a bed, I would give him mine, and I would gladly lie on the ground for the good news he brought me." She sent couriers to Paris. They returned and lied to her. The king, they assured her, was quite well. But the furtive tears of a nun betrayed the truth. Marguerite stayed in the convent for 40 days, acting as abbess and singing the old sacred chants with the nuns. Back in Pau or Nérac, she resigned herself to austerities, to her husband's infidelities, and to her daughter's wandering willfulness. She found comfort, after all her brave half-Protestant years, in the color and incense and hypnotic music of Catholic ritual. The Calvinism that was capturing southern France chilled her and frightened her back to her childhood piety. In December 1549, while watching a comet in the skies, she caught a fever that proved strong enough to break a frame and spirit already weakened by life's inclemencies. Years before, she had written lines as if half in love with the anesthesia of death. "Lord, when will come the day, wished ardently, that I shall be by love drawn close to thee? Still then, my parting sighs, let me not weep, give the best gift of all, sweet boon of sleep." 7. Diane de Poitiers. The old gallant had 7 children, all by Claude. The eldest son, Francis, was like his father, handsome, charming, gay. Henry, born in 1514, was quiet, shy, a bit neglected. He matched his brother only in misfortune. Their 4 years of hardship and humiliation in Spain had marked them indelibly. Francis died 6 years after liberation. Henry grew more taciturn than before, turned within himself, shunned the frolics of the court. He had companions, but they rarely saw him smile. Men said he had become Spanish in Spain. It was not his choice to marry Catherine de Médicis, nor hers to marry him. She, too, had had tribulations. Both her parents had died of syphilis within 22 days of her birth in 1519, and from that time till her marriage she was shifted from place to place, helpless and unasked. When Florence expelled its Medici rulers in 1527, it kept Caterina as a hostage for their good behavior, and when these exiles returned to besiege the city, she was threatened with death to deter them. Clement VII used her as a pawn to win France to papal policies. She went obediently to Marseille, a girl of 14, and married a boy of 14 who hardly spoke to her during all the festival. When they arrived in Paris, she met a cold reception because she brought too many Italians with her. She became to the Parisians the Florentine, and though she tried hard to charm them, neither they nor her husband ever warmed to her. Despite many efforts, she remained barren for 10 years, and the doctors suspected some evil inheritance from her infected parents. Losing hope of offspring, Catherine de Médicis, as she was called in France, went to Francis weeping and offered to submit to a divorce and retire to a convent. The king graciously refused the sacrifice. At last the gates of motherhood burst, and children came in almost annual succession. 10 in all. They were chiefly Francis II, who would marry Mary Stuart, Elizabeth, who would marry Philip II, Charles IX, who would give the order for the massacre of St. Bartholomew, Edward, who became the tragic Henry III, and Marguerite of Valois, who would marry and harry Henry of Navarre. Through all but the first 4 of these barren or fertile years, her husband, while begetting children on her body, gave his love to Diane de Poitiers. Diane was unique among the royal mistresses who played so leading a role in French history. She was not beautiful. When Henry, 17, fell in love with her in 1536, she was already 37. Her hair was turning gray, and wrinkles were beginning to score the years on her brow. Her only physical charms were grace and a complexion kept fresh by washing with cold water at all seasons. She was not a courtesan. Apparently she was faithful to her husband, Louis de Brezé, till his death. And though, like Henry, she indulged in 2 or 3 asides during her royal liaison, these were venial incidents, mere grace notes in her song of love. She was not romantic. Rather, she was too practical, making hay while her sun shone. France condemned not her morals, but her money. She was not like Francis's mignons, pretty heads but empty, prancing on gay feet till motherhood surprised them. Diane had good education, good sense, good manners, good wit. Here was a mistress who charmed with her mind. She came of high lineage and was brought up by the art-loving court of the Bourbons at Moulins. Her father, Jean de Poitiers, Comte de Saint-Vallier, shared the Duke of Bourbon's treason after trying to prevent it. He was captured and sentenced to death in 1523. Diane's husband, in favor with Francis, secured her father's pardon. Louis de Brezé was grandson of Charles VII by Agnès Sorel. He had ability or influence, for he became Grand Seneschal and governor of Normandy. He was 56 when Diane, 16, became his wife in 1515. When he died in 1531, she raised to his memory at Rouen a magnificent tomb with an inscription vowing eternal fidelity. She never married again and wore, thereafter, only black and white. She met Henry when, a lad of 7, he was being handed over at Bayonne as a hostage for his father. The bewildered boy wept. Diane, then 27, mothered and comforted him, whose own mother, Claude, was 2 years dead. And perhaps the memory of those pitying embraces revived in him when he met her again 11 years later. Though then 4 years a husband, he was still mentally immature, as well as abnormally melancholy and diffident. He wanted a mother more than a wife. And here again Diane appeared, quiet, tender, comforting. He came to her first as a son, and their relations for some time were apparently chaste. Her affection and counsel gave him confidence. Under her tutelage, he ceased to be a misanthrope and prepared to be a king. Popular opinion credited them with having one child, Diane de France, whom she brought up with her 2 daughters by Brezé. She also adopted the daughter born to Henry in 1538 by a Piedmontese maiden who paid for her royal moment by a lifetime as a nun. Another illegitimate child resulted from Henry's later affair with Mary Fleming, governess of Mary Stuart. Despite these experiments, his devotion was increasingly to Diane de Poitiers. He wrote to her poems of real excellence. He showered her with jewelry and estates. He did not entirely neglect Catherine. Usually he dined and spent the evenings with her, and she, grateful for the parings of his love, accepted in silent sorrow the fact that another woman was the real Dauphiness of France. She must have felt it as an added wound that Diane occasionally prodded Henry into sleeping with his wife. His accession to the throne did not lower Diane's state. He wrote to her the most abject letters, entreating her to let him be her servant for life. His infatuation made her almost as rich as the queen. He guaranteed to Diane a fixed percentage of all receipts from the sale of appointments to office, and nearly all appointments were in her power. He gave her the crown jewels that the Duchesse d'Étampes had worn. When the Duchess protested, Diane threatened to accuse her of Protestantism, and was bought off only by a gift of property. Henry allowed her to keep for her use 400,000 thalers that Francis had bequeathed for the secret support of the Protestant princes in Germany. So dowered, Diane rebuilt, on a design by Philibert Delorme, the old Brezé mansion of Annay into an extensive chateau that became not only a second home for the king, but also a museum of art and a handsome rendezvous for poets, artists, diplomats, dukes, generals, cardinals, mistresses, and philosophers. Here, in effect, sat the Privy Council of the state, and Diane was prime ministress, passionless and intelligent. Everywhere, at Annay, Chenonceau, Amboise, the Louvre, dishes, coats of arms, works of art, choir stalls, bore the bold symbol of the royal romance, 2 Ds placed back to back with a dash between them forming the letter H. There is something touching and beautiful about this unique friendship, built on love and money, but enduring till death. In the struggle of the Church against heresy, Diane put all her influence behind orthodoxy and suppression. She had abundant reasons for piety. Her daughter was married to a son of Francis, Duke of Guise, and Francis, with his brother Charles, Cardinal of Lorraine, both favorites at Annay, were the leaders of the Catholic party in France. As for Henry, his childhood piety had been intensified by his years in Spain. His love letters confused God and Diane as rivals for his heart. The Church was helpful. It gave him 3 million golden crowns for cancelling his father's decree restricting the power of ecclesiastical courts. Nevertheless, Protestantism was growing in France. Calvin and others were sending in missionaries whose success was alarming. Several towns, Caen, Poitiers, La Rochelle, and many in Provence, were predominantly Huguenot by 1559. A priest reckoned the French Protestants in that year at nearly a quarter of the population. Says a Catholic historian, the source of the apostasy from Rome, ecclesiastical corruption, had not been removed, nay, had only been strengthened by the concordat between Leo X and Francis I. In the middle and lower classes, Protestantism was in part a protest against a Catholic government that curbed municipal autonomy, taxed unbearably, and wasted revenues and lives in war. The nobility, shorn of its former political power by the kings, looked with envy at Lutheran princes victorious over Charles V. Perhaps a similar feudalism could be restored in France by using widespread popular resentment against abuses in church and state. Prominent nobles like Gaspard de Coligny, his younger brother François d'Andelot, Prince Louis de Condé, and his brother Antoine de Bourbon took active part in organizing the Protestant revolt. For its theology, Gallic Protestantism adopted Calvin's Institutes. Its author and language were French, and its logic appealed to the French mind. After 1550, Luther was almost forgotten in France. The very name Huguenot came from Zurich through Geneva to Provence. In May 1559, the Protestants felt strong enough to send deputies to their first General Synod, held secretly in Paris. By 1561, there were 2,000 Reformed or Calvinistic churches in France. Henry II set himself to crush out the heresy. This book is continued on Cassette 7, Side 1.